The world's most critical geopolitical relationship is no longer being managed by the rules of international diplomacy, but by the logic of a corporate transaction. When Donald Trump and Xi Jinping concluded their recent high-stakes summit in Beijing, global markets and traditional allies did not find reassurance. Instead, they found a profound shift in how global power is negotiated. For decades, the friction between the United States and China was kept in check by a complex web of treaties, military deterrence, and institutional guardrails. In a single meeting, those guardrails were replaced by a framework that treats global security commitments as liquid assets. The stakes are no longer just about trade tariffs or technological dominance. They are about whether the foundational security guarantees of the modern world are now up for sale. The unresolved question hanging over this new era is simple. What happens to the global order when the world's ultimate guarantor of security decides that alliances are merely bargaining chips? To understand why this summit sent shockwaves through global capitals, one must look at the nature of the international system. Since the mid-20th century, global stability has relied on predictability. Alliances like NATO or bilateral security agreements in Asia function because adversaries believe the United States will defend its partners regardless of the immediate economic cost. This predictability is the invisible infrastructure of global commerce. It allows insurance companies to underwrite container ships moving through the South China Sea, and it allows tech corporations to build advanced semiconductor factories in East Asia. When that predictability is replaced by transactional diplomacy, the entire system begins to warp. Under a transactional model, foreign policy is no longer guided by long-term strategic doctrines. It is guided by immediate, quantifiable returns, such as agricultural purchase agreements or manufacturing investments. This shift did not happen in a vacuum. It is the logical culmination of a decade-long divergence in how Washington and Beijing view global power. Following the end of the Cold War, the prevailing assumption in Western capitals was that integrating China into the global economic system would eventually align its political interests with those of the West. Instead, China leveraged global trade to build immense economic and military capacity while maintaining its centralized state model. By the time the United States attempted to pivot its foreign policy to counter this rise, the economic interdependence between the two nations had become absolute. The traditional hardline stance of strategic competition sought to contain China through military alliances and technology decoupling. However, the economic incentives for cooperation remained massive, creating a permanent tension between security objectives and corporate profits. The mechanism that emerged from this summit marks the abandonment of that containment strategy. During the closed-door sessions, the language of international relations was fundamentally rewritten. Rather than maintaining the established paradigm of strategic competition, the summit witnessed the adoption of a concept framed by Beijing: constructive strategic stability. On the surface, the phrase sounds stabilizing, but in the calculus of geopolitics, it signals a profound concession. Under this new mechanism, any action that threatens bilateral harmony is viewed as a disruption to stability. This provides Beijing with a powerful rhetorical and diplomatic tool. If Washington attempts to fulfill its traditional security roles, such as selling defense systems to regional partners, Beijing can now point to the agreed-upon framework of stability to claim that the United States is violating the terms of the relationship. This mechanism creates a de facto Group of Two, or G2 relationship, establishing the United States and China as peer managers of the global system. In practice, this gives Beijing unprecedented leverage over American operations in the Pacific. For decades, the United States maintained a policy of strategic ambiguity regarding Taiwan, paired with a multi-billion-dollar commitment to supply the island with defensive weapons. During the summit, Chinese President Xi Jinping issued a stark caution, stating that mishandling the Taiwan issue could push the two superpowers toward direct clashes and conflicts. In a traditional diplomatic setting, such a warning would be met with a reiteration of security commitments. In this transaction, however, the response was highly flexible. The security commitments and arms packages that have anchored Pacific stability for generations were suddenly placed on the negotiating table, open to being bartered for Chinese business deals and market access. The immediate consequence of this transactional approach is a radical realignment of winners and losers. The clearest winner is Beijing, which has successfully elevated itself to a peer status that effectively grants it a veto over U.S. actions in its backyard. Large multinational corporations also gain a temporary window of predictability, as the immediate threat of escalating trade wars recedes in favor of bilateral business arrangements. The losers, however, are the traditional U.S. allies across Southeast Asia and the wider Indo-Pacific. Nations that have built their defense architectures around the certainty of American protection now find themselves in a precarious position. If security guarantees are negotiable, these smaller states must calculate how long they can resist pressure from a dominant regional superpower without a guaranteed American shield. For ordinary people, the consequences are indirect but profound. The global supply chains that deliver electronics, automobiles, and consumer goods rely on the absolute freedom of navigation in the Western Pacific. If the rules governing these waterways are no longer enforced by international law, but are instead subject to the shifting terms of bilateral deals between Washington and Beijing, shipping costs and political risk premiums will inevitably rise. Governments in the region are already reacting. Rather than relying on a single superpower, they are beginning to diversify their security partnerships and accelerate their own military spending. The long-term effect is not a more stable world, but a highly fragmented one, where every nation must fend for itself or strike its own separate deal with Beijing. A common misunderstanding surrounding this summit is that it represents a return to a stable, bipolar world reminiscent of the Cold War. This narrative is fundamentally flawed. The United States and the Soviet Union operated in two distinct, isolated economic spheres. They did not rely on each other for manufacturing, supply chains, or sovereign debt management. Today, the United States and China are locked in a state of deep economic codependency. The shift toward a G2 framework is not an attempt to isolate an adversary. It is an attempt to manage an unavoidable partner through corporate bargaining. Most people mistake the rhetoric of stability for actual peace, failing to realize that a stability purchased by sacrificing long-term security commitments is inherently fragile. Looking ahead, this new transactional reality leads to two realistic scenarios. The first scenario is one of managed spheres of influence. In this outcome, the United States gradually scales back its forward military presence and security assistance in East Asia in exchange for major economic concessions, such as massive Chinese investments in American manufacturing or guaranteed purchase agreements for American energy and agriculture. For this to occur, Washington must continuously prioritize domestic economic metrics over global strategic positioning, while Beijing must remain willing to pay an economic premium to secure its regional hegemony. The global system would fracture into distinct zones of influence, ending the era of a single unified global rules-based order. The second scenario is one of systemic miscalculation. Because transactional diplomacy lacks clear rules and institutional guardrails, it relies entirely on the personal understanding between individual leaders. If Beijing misinterprets American flexibility as a total abdication of its regional role, it may embolden actions that cross invisible lines, such as a full maritime blockade of critical shipping lanes or an aggressive enforcement of territorial claims. If Washington suddenly decides that its core strategic interests are threatened, the lack of established communication channels and institutional deterrence mechanisms could cause a rapid escalation. Without the predictable guardrails of the past, a minor confrontation could quickly spiral into the very conflict both sides claim they want to avoid. The Beijing summit did not solve the fundamental contradictions between the world's two largest powers. It merely changed the currency in which those contradictions are negotiated. By replacing long-term strategic alliances with short-term transactional deals, the international system has entered uncharted territory. The invisible architecture that guaranteed global stability for nearly a century is being dismantled in favor of a bilateral condominium. The world is left to watch a high-stakes experiment in power politics, where the ultimate price of a business deal might be the global order itself. The question that remains is whether a system built on the volatile logic of transactions can ever truly deliver the stability it promises.